At 70, Henry Cole had stopped believing that a dying farm always looked dead. Sometimes it still grew things. Just fewer every year. His 80-acre farm still produced enough to keep him working. But the western half had become harder to defend against summer. By July, hot wind crossed the neighboring open fields and hit Henry's land without anything slowing it. The exposed ground dried first. Young plants along the western edge struggled first. And every year, Henry seemed to spend more money trying to replace moisture the wind carried away. That was why he was at Green Valley Nursery on a cold March morning. Not for trees. He needed several rolls of used irrigation tubing. The nursery was selling cheaply. Henry had loaded the last roll when he noticed a tractor pulling a trailer toward the back of the property. The trailer was full of trees. Thousands of them. Young trees in containers and root bundles were stacked together. Some were thin. Some leaned sharply. Others had uneven branches or trunks that forked too low. But they weren't dead. Henry watched a worker unload them beside a large disposal area. He walked over. What happened to those? The worker shrugged. Rejects? Henry picked up one tree. Its trunk curved several inches before straightening. Leaves were sparse. But the bark was alive. Disease? No. Bad roots? Some probably. Mostly grading. Henry looked at the growing pile. A nursery manager named Paul Mercer approached from behind. Need something? Mr. Cole? Henry pointed. What's wrong with these? Paul looked at the trees as though the answer were obvious. Nothing worth selling. Henry turned toward him. Paul explained. Customers wanted uniform nursery stock. Straight trunks. Balanced crowns. Consistent height. Strong growth. Trees that looked healthy the moment they were unloaded. These didn't make the grade. Some had grown too slowly. Some were undersized. Some had been damaged early and recovered badly. Others simply looked wrong beside better specimens of the same age. How many? Paul checked a clipboard. Close to 5,000 by the time we're finished. Henry looked at the pile again. 5,000. He imagined the price of buying 5,000 first-grade trees. Impossible. Then he imagined his western boundary. Nearly bare. Every summer, wind entered there and crossed his fields unobstructed. Henry picked up another rejected tree. This one leaned badly. Paul smiled. You thinking firewood? No. Then what? Henry ran his thumb across the bark. If they're alive, why throw them away? Because alive isn't the same as saleable. That sentence stayed with Henry. He understood Paul's position. The nursery wasn't running a charity. Every square foot occupied by a crooked tree was space that could hold one. Customers would actually buy. Paul judged trees by a standard Henry didn't need. Henry looked toward the disposal pile. What would you charge me for all of them? Paul laughed. Then realized Henry wasn't joking. All 5,000? Every living one. What are you going to do with 5,000 reject trees? Henry didn't answer immediately. He wasn't completely sure. He only knew his farm had a problem that arrived every summer from the same direction. And here were thousands of living stems nobody wanted because they weren't straight enough to stand in someone's front yard. Plant them. Paul stared at him. Henry, some of those won't make it. I know. A lot won't look good even if they do. Don't need them to. Paul folded his arms. What exactly do you need? Henry looked at the crooked tree in his hand. Something between my ground and the wind. By afternoon, they had an agreement. The nursery wanted the rejects removed more than it wanted to keep them. Henry would handle transportation. 2 days later, the first trailer arrived at his farm. Tom Barrett, Henry's neighbor, watched from across the road. He came over when he saw the trees. What'd you pay for these? Less than they cost to throw away. Tom lifted one. The trunk bent like a question mark. He laughed. This thing couldn't grow straight in a nursery. You think it'll save your farm? Henry took the tree from him. He looked across the western field. Dust moved low over the exposed soil. Then he looked back at the 5,000 rejected trees waiting beside his barn. No. Tom raised an eyebrow. Henry rested the crooked sapling against the trailer. I think expecting one tree to save anything would be stupid. He pointed toward the western boundary. But 5,000? Tom stopped smiling. Henry picked up his shovel. The nursery had judged every tree individually. Straight enough, tall enough, pretty enough, saleable, or worthless. Henry was about to judge them by a completely different standard. He didn't need 5,000 perfect trees. He needed enough imperfect ones to survive together. And before planting the first one, the 70-year-old farmer needed to find exactly where the wind was entering his dying land. By sunrise, Henry understood the first problem. He hadn't bought 5,000 trees. He had bought 5,000 questions. They covered the ground behind his equipment shed in crooked rows, some nearly 6 feet tall, others barely reaching his waist. Some leaned hard enough to look permanently windblown. Others had forked trunks, thin crowns, broken leaders, or branches growing in directions no nursery customer would accept. From a distance, they looked like exactly what Green Valley Nursery had called them, rejects. Henry picked up the first tree. He scratched the bark with his thumbnail. Green. He checked the buds. Alive. Then the roots. Messu. But workable. He marked the trunk with white chalk. Keep. The second tree looked better above ground. Straighter trunk. Fuller crown. Henry pulled it from its container. Half the root system was black. He set it aside. By 8 o'clock, Tom Barrett was standing at the edge of the rows. You're checking everyone? Henry didn't look up. Yep. Tom stared across the thousands of trees. You'll still be doing this next Christmas. Then I better stop talking. Tom picked up a sapling bent almost like a question mark. This one's garbage. Henry took it from him. He checked the bark, the buds, the roots, then marked it. Keep. Tom laughed. You'd pay money for that? No. Then why keep it? Henry handed the tree back. Because I'm not selling it. Tom's smile disappeared. That was the difference. The nursery had needed trees that could stand alone in someone's yard and justify a price tag. Straight trunk. Balanced crown. Uniform growth. Henry needed something else. Roots that could establish. Branches that could fill space. Trunks that could survive long enough to stand between his soil and the western wind. A tree could fail one job and still be useful for another. By noon, Henry had 4 groups. Strong, viable rejects. Marginal but living. Small trees that would need protection. And trees that weren't rejects anymore. They were dead. Those went aside. Tom pointed toward the pile. Thought you were planting every one. Every living one worth planting. You're changing the rules. Henry cut through a damaged root. No. I'm learning what the rules actually are. That afternoon, the numbers began to bother him. 5,000 trees had sounded like abundance at the nursery. On his farm, they looked like 5,000 holes, 5,000 root systems, 5,000 chances to lose water, 5,000 things that could die after consuming hours of work. The trees had cost almost nothing. Keeping them alive wouldn't. Henry put down his chalk. He didn't plant a single one. Instead, he walked west. The boundary stretched nearly 3/4 of a mile beside open agricultural ground. No mature hedgerow, no wooded strip. Almost nothing substantial between his fields and the prevailing summer wind. Dry grass bent southeast. Dust moved low across an exposed patch. Henry stood still. For years, this side had always suffered first. First plants to wilt. First soil to crust. First section demanding more irrigation. He had treated each symptom separately. More water. More mulch. More replanting. But the damage kept beginning in roughly the same place. Henry turned toward the thousands of rejected trees behind the barn. Tom had followed him. You really think those weak things can stop all that? Henry watched the grass bend. No. Tom frowned. Then what are you doing? Henry pointed toward the western boundary. I don't need to stop it. He walked to a fence post and tied a strip of orange cloth near the top. The wind caught it immediately. The cloth snapped toward the southeast. Henry watched for several seconds. Then he drove a wooden stake into the ground. What's that for? Tom asked. Henry pulled another stake from the truck. To find out where the first tree belongs, Tom looked back toward the thousands, waiting beside the barn. "You've got 5,000 trees and you're worried about the first one?" Henry started walking south along the boundary. "That's exactly why I'm worried about the first one." By sunset, orange strips marked several points along the western edge. The trees remained unplanted. 5,000 imperfect silhouettes waited in the fading light. Yesterday, Henry had thought his problem was how to plant them all. Now he understood that was the wrong question. A cheap tree planted in the wrong place was still expensive. Tomorrow, before digging a single hole, Henry would find exactly where the farm was losing the fight. Only then would the rejects get their second chance. Henry spent the next 6 days planting nothing. 5,000 rejected trees waited behind the equipment shed, their roots protected and watered, while he walked the western edge carrying wooden stakes, orange cloth, and an old notebook. Tom Barrett thought he had lost his nerve. "You bought 5,000 trees to watch ribbons?" Henry tied another strip to a fence post. "I bought 5,000 chances to get this wrong." The wind caught the cloth immediately. It snapped southeast. Henry wrote, "NW corner hard." He walked another 100 feet and tied a second strip. Still southeast, but quieter. Another 100 feet. Hard again. Tom followed him. "Wind's wind." "Henry." "No." Henry pointed toward the 3 ribbons. "Sam direction." Different force. That difference was what he had ignored for years. By noon, the western boundary had become a line of orange signals. Near the northwest ridge, the cloth stayed nearly horizontal. Behind the equipment shed, it fluttered. Beside a shallow depression choked with tall weeds, it moved steadily, but without the violent snapping. Henry marked everything. Then he walked into the field. 50 feet. 100. 200. The wind followed him. On exposed ground, fine soil, moved close to the surface. Loose mulch had migrated east. Leaves on young plants never stopped moving. Henry crouched and pushed 2 fingers into the soil. Dry. He crossed behind the equipment shed. Same morning. Same recent watering. He dug again. The surface was dry there too. But underneath, the soil felt cooler. Henry looked back at the shed. 24 feet wide. 8 feet high. Nothing special. Yet the plants behind it had always grown slightly better. For years, Henry had called that coincidence. Now he wrote, "Behind shed soil, holds longer." Tom read over his shoulder. "You're saying that building is saving the field?" Henry shook his head. "I'm saying I should have asked why the ground behind it behaves differently." The next afternoon was hotter. Henry wanted that. He dug 2 shallow holes, one on the exposed ridge, another behind the shed. Same depth, same amount of water, no cover. The following afternoon, he returned. The exposed hole had dried harder at the surface, several inches down. The protected hole still held more moisture. Tom rubbed the soil between his fingers. "So the wind's stealing your water?" "Some of it." "Then you've proved it?" "No." Henry closed his notebook. "I've found something worth testing." That distinction mattered. The farm had other problems. Soil changed from one section to another. Drainage changed. Sun exposure changed. Roots competed for water. Henry knew better than to blame 40 years of trouble on one afternoon with 2 holes. But one fact kept bothering him. The damage always began in roughly the same place. The west. On the 4th day, Henry crossed the property line and walked into the neighboring field. For nearly a mile, there was almost nothing tall enough to interrupt the prevailing wind. When he turned around, his farm looked different. Not dead. Exposed. That was the word. He had spent years putting things into the land. Water. Seed. Fertilizer. Compost, when he could afford it. But every summer, the western half faced miles of hot moving air with almost nothing standing between them. Henry returned to the nursery rejects. For the first time that week, he selected a tree, one of the stronger ones. Tom followed him to the northwest corner. Finally, one. Henry dug carefully, spread the roots, filled the hole, and watered deeply. The young trunk leaned slightly east. Tom looked at it, crooked. Above them, the orange ribbon snapped violently in the same direction. Henry glanced at the tree. So is the wind. He drove a stake beside it. Then, instead of reaching for another sapling, Henry walked 30 feet into the field and tied another strip of orange cloth, then another farther in. Tom stared at him. "You're still measuring?" Henry looked back at the single tree, standing against miles of open ground. "One tree can't tell me anything today." He pointed toward the thousands waiting near the barn. "But someday I want to know what changed." The nursery had judged every tree by what it looked like standing alone. Henry was about to test a different question. What happened when thousands of imperfect trees stood between vulnerable ground and the thing hurting it? He closed the notebook. Tomorrow, the planting would begin. Not where the holes were easiest to dig. Not where the rows would look straightest. Where the damage entered first. Henry began at sunrise. Not beside the barn, where the trees were stacked. Not near the house, where watering would be easier. He drove his shovel into the northwest corner, the place where every orange ribbon had snapped hardest. If the damage entered there first, Henry wanted the trees to meet it there first. He stretched 3 planting lines south. The first faced the open fields. The second sat behind it, offset, so its trees filled the gaps. The third sat farther inside. Tom Barrett arrived before Henry finished the first 100 feet. 3 rows? Henry kept digging. In this section? Why 3? Henry pointed west. Because I'm not planting a fence. Tom looked at the straight lines of stakes. Looks like one. A fence tries to stop something. Henry lifted the crooked sapling beside him. I need the wind to pass through these. Tom laughed. Then what's the point? Henry planted the tree. Make it work harder getting through. That was the first part of the design Henry trusted. Not a solid wall. A permeable boundary. Trunks. Branches. And eventually leaves would interrupt moving air without pretending they could eliminate it. The strongest viable rejects went into the outer positions. Not the prettiest. The ones Henry believed had the best chance of establishing under exposure. Smaller trees stayed behind them. Every tree got the same careful treatment. Roots spread instead of folded. Soil packed without crushing. Deep water after planting. By sunset, 184 trees stood in the ground. Henry could barely straighten his back. He stepped away to look. The result was almost embarrassing. Thin trunks, sparse branches, crooked crowns. Behind them stretched miles of open agricultural ground. A hard gust came across the field. Every sapling bent east. Tom watched. Wind didn't even notice. Henry picked up the hose. Today, the next morning, he continued. By the 4th day, however, a different problem appeared. Water. 5,000 trees might eventually protect moisture. Right now, they consumed it. Henry watched the soil around the newest plantings dry faster than he expected. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had brought trees onto the farm to reduce stress. If keeping them alive required endless extra water, he hadn't solved anything. He had created another crop that needed saving. So Henry slowed down. Tom found him moving his stakes away from the exposed ridge. I thought that was the worst section. It is. Then why aren't you planting it? Henry drove a new stake lower on the slope. Because it's the worst section. Tom waited. Henry pointed uphill. The orange ribbon there snapped almost continuously. The soil beneath it was already drying. I want trees there. Henry said. That doesn't mean trees can establish there first. That changed the plan. Henry stopped treating the 5,000 rejects like fence posts. They were living material. The drawing in his notebook didn't decide where they could survive. The land did. He planted aggressively where exposure was high, but establishment still looked possible. Where the ridge seemed too harsh, he left gaps and marked them. Where the equipment shed already interrupted the wind, he connected new plantings to that existing protection. Near the shallow depression, smaller rejects went into the calmer ground. The pattern stopped looking perfect. Henry considered that progress. 2 weeks later, more than 1,000 trees stretched along the western and northwestern perimeter. Every evening, Henry walked them. Some stood straight. Some leaned. One trunk curved so badly it resembled an S. Tom stopped beside it. "That's the ugliest one yet." Henry touched a branch. New buds were opening. "Looks busy to me." "Doing what?" "Living." That was enough. Henry no longer cared whether a tree could become the centerpiece of someone's front yard. A crooked trunk could carry branches. Branches could carry leaves. And enough leaves. Branche. And trunks might someday change what happened to the air passing through them. Wegslaughter. The final viable rejects went into the ground. Some sections had 3 rows. Others had more depth. Some remained deliberately incomplete. Nothing looked uniform. Nothing looked finished. Henry stood at the western edge as the afternoon wind rose. The first row bent, then the second, then the third. Behind them, the farm looked exactly as it had before. Dry. Exposed. Unimpressed by his work. Tom came through the gate. "So what did 5,000 trees buy you?" Henry watched another gust move through the rows. "Nothing yet." That answer surprised Tom. Henry looked toward the coming summer. Planting had only placed the bet. Heat would decide which trees were strong enough to stay in the game. And Henry was about to discover that some of the places he had planted them were already wrong. By late June, Henry stopped counting how many trees he had planted. He started counting how many were dying. The first warning appeared on the northwest ridge. A young tree that had looked healthy 2 weeks earlier developed brown edges on its leaves. 3 days later, half its foliage was dry. Henry scratched the bark with his thumbnail. Green underneath. Still alive. He watered it. The tree died anyway. Then another went. Then 6 more. By the middle of July, Henry could walk certain sections of the new Windbreak and find a dead sapling every 20 or 30 feet. Some never established properly. Some leafed out, then collapsed when the heat arrived. Others remained alive but looked miserable thin crowns. Curled leaves. Almost no new growth. Tom Barrett didn't need to say anything. His expression did it for him. Henry was carrying 2 dead saplings toward the barn when Tom stopped his truck. "How many?" "Don't know yet." "Hundreds, probably." Tom looked toward the rows. The nursery rejects that had seemed questionable in March looked even worse under July heat. Many leaned. Several had lost leaves. The gaps between them were obvious. "You surprised?" Henry dropped the dead trees beside the barn. "Yes." Tom raised an eyebrow. Henry wasn't going to pretend otherwise. He had expected losses. He hadn't expected the pattern to appear this quickly. That evening, Henry walked every row with his notebook. He marked dead trees with red paint on the nearest stake. 1, 3, 7, 12. Then entire clusters. The northwest ridge was worst. The shallow protected depression was much better. Behind the equipment shed, almost everything remained alive. Henry stopped. That bothered him. If the nursery trees were simply too weak, failures should have been scattered more randomly. They weren't. Henry continued south. Another exposed rise. More dead trees. Then a lower section. Fewer. He opened the notebook. Same trees. Different losses. The next afternoon, temperatures climbed again. Henry checked the soil beside a dead tree on the ridge. Dry. He dug deeper. Still dry. Then he walked to a surviving tree in the depression. The surface was dry there too, but several inches down. The soil retained moisture. Henry looked toward the orange cloth he'd left on one of the old wind stakes. On the ridge, it snapped violently. Below, the cloth moved less. Henry finally saw his mistake. He had mapped the wind before planting, but in several places, he had ignored what his own map told him. He wanted a continuous boundary, so he'd planted trees across the hardest exposed sections simply because the design required trees there. The land didn't care about his design. The weakest nursery stock paid for that mistake first. Henry stopped replacing dead trees immediately. Instead, he marked every failure. Red stake, date, location, condition of soil, exposure. If a tree died, Henry wanted the death to tell him something. Be August. The rows looked terrible in places. Tom walked the western boundary with him. You could pull all this out before it gets worse. Henry kept walking. Why? Because half these things look like hell. They're not supposed to look good. They're supposed to live. Henry stopped. That part you're right about. He pointed toward a section ahead. 37 trees had been planted there. 11 were dead. Farther down, 40 similar trees occupied a protected dip. Only 3 had died. Tom stared at the 2 sections. Better trees? Same batch. More water? Same schedule. Tom looked toward the ridge, then toward the lower ground. Henry said nothing. He wanted Tom to see it. The failures weren't just losses anymore. They were information. That evening, Henry dug beside several surviving trees. Roots were beginning to move beyond the original planting holes. He checked the failures too. Some had root problems. Some had simply failed to establish. There was no single explanation, but the geographic pattern was undeniable. Henry drew red circles on his farm map. They clustered in the most exposed locations. For months, he'd been asking, how do I keep 5,000 weak trees alive? Now he crossed that question out. Underneath, he wrote, why do they die here and live there? That was a better question. The first summer hadn't proven Henry right. If anything, from the road, it looked as though the nursery had been right all along. The rejects were weak. Hundreds were struggling. Some would never survive. But Henry had discovered something more useful than a perfect survival rate. Every dead tree had tested one tiny piece of his farm. And together, the failures were beginning to draw a map Henry had never been able to see before. The nursery had thrown the trees away because they failed a grading system. Henry's dying land was giving them another test. This time, even the trees that failed were leaving him an answer. By September, Henry had stopped removing the dead trees. He left them exactly where they had failed. Every brown trunk became a marker. Every empty planting hole became a piece of evidence. At 70, Henry knew failure became expensive only when you learned nothing from it. So he walked the perimeter again. This time, he carried 3 cans of paint, red for dead, yellow for struggling, white for healthy. The pattern appeared before Henry finished the first mile. On the northwest ridge, red dominated. The ground there was slightly higher than the surrounding field. Nothing stood west of it for nearly a mile. The wind hit first. The soil dried first. And the rejected trees died first. Henry counted. 28 dead in one section. 9 struggling. Only 14 looked reasonably established. He wrote the numbers down. Then he moved downhill. Within 200 feet, everything changed. More white. Less red. The trees were from the same nursery batches. They had been planted within days of one another. They had received roughly the same establishment watering, yet survival improved dramatically. Henry crouched beside one healthy tree. Its trunk was ugly. The main stem bent sharply at 18 inches, then corrected upward. The nursery had rejected it immediately. But new growth extended from several branches. Henry scratched the bark, bright green underneath. Weak, he muttered, then smiled. He walked back uphill. A straighter tree stood dead on the ridge. That comparison changed something in Henry. He had been unconsciously dividing the trees into strong and weak. Now he began dividing the land that way. Strong site, weak site, protected site, exposed site, moisture-holding site, fast-drying site. The trees weren't merely being tested by the farm. They were testing the farm for him. Henry opened his map. The red marks formed clusters. One followed the northwest ridge. Another appeared near a dry corner where the soil was shallow. A third formed where competing vegetation had taken moisture aggressively around the young roots. But behind the equipment shed, almost no red appeared. Along the protected depression, survival remained high. Henry drew circles around those areas. Then he wrote, "Failure is not random." Tom Barrett found him measuring distances between dead trees. "You've officially started studying corpses." Henry pointed toward the ridge. 28 dead. "I noticed. Down there." Cease. Tom looked toward the lower section. So? Some planting week. Henry handed him the shovel. Here. Tom dug beside one of the dead trees. The ground broke apart dry. Henry led him downhill. Again. Several inches beneath the surface. The soil was cooler. Tom rubbed it between his fingers. More moisture. Henry nodded. Then he pointed toward two orange ribbons. The one on the ridge snapped hard. The lower ribbon moved steadily but less violently. Tom looked back toward the dead trees. So what? You water the ridge more? That was my first thought. And? Henry looked across the farm. If I have to keep 5,000 trees alive forever with extra water, I haven't built protection. He paused. I've built another crop that needs protecting. That was the trap. Henry had planted trees to reduce stress on his land. If the trees themselves required constant intervention simply to survive, the system would consume the resources it was supposed to conserve. So Henry changed strategy. He stopped replacing every dead tree in the exact same hole. Instead, he studied why the location had failed. Some sites needed better establishment care. Others needed a different kind of tree, and the harshest positions might need protection before another vulnerable sapling could survive there. Henry began using the surviving trees as anchors. Where one tree had established, he planted replacements slightly behind it, rather than directly beside the dead trunk. Where several survivors formed a small cluster, he added smaller trees on the protected side. He wasn't rebuilding a straight line anymore. He was building outward from success. Weeks passed. Henry's map became covered in red, yellow and white. From a distance, it looked chaotic. To Henry, it was becoming the most detailed picture of his farm he'd ever possessed. For 40 years, he had known the northwest corner was difficult. Now he knew exactly where difficulty intensified. He knew where moisture lasted, where wind accelerated, where a shallow depression created protection, where 20 feet changed survival. The 5,000 rejected trees had become thousands of biological test points. Some lived, some died. Both groups were useful. One evening, Henry stood beside the first tree he'd planted months earlier. The crooked sapling at the northwest corner was still alive. Barely. Its leaves were sparse. Its trunk leaned. But behind it, several smaller trees had survived better. Henry looked from one to the next. That was when he abandoned the idea of a perfect wall. Straight rows had been his design. The farm was showing him another. Protection might need to happen in layers. One survivor sheltering another, then another behind that. Different heights. Different densities. Not a fence made from trees. A system that became more protected as you moved inward. Henry drew 3 staggered lines across the northwest corner of his map. Then he wrote one sentence underneath. Stop building a wall. Build layers. The nursery had thrown away 5,000 trees because each one failed to look strong enough alone. Henry was beginning to understand their real opportunity. Maybe none of them needed to stand alone. Henry spent the winter looking at gaps. From the farmhouse window, his 5,000 rejected trees hardly resembled a windbreak. Some sections were dense. Others were interrupted by dead saplings. On the northwest ridge, the original straight rows looked especially bad. A line of living trees. 3 dead. 2 living. Another gap. Then a cluster of survivors. Anyone judging the project by appearance would have called it a failure. Henry no longer cared about appearance. He cared about what happened behind the survivors. One February morning, the 70-year-old farmer walked to the northwest corner during a strong west wind. He carried strips of orange cloth. Henry tied one outside the first row. It snapped violently. He tied another behind the surviving trees. Still moving hard. Then another farther inward, behind a second cluster. The cloth moved differently. Not still. Henry never expected stillness. But less violently. He stood there watching. One imperfect row hadn't accomplished much. Several staggered groups had. Henry returned to his notebook. Not wall. Depth. That spring, he changed the planting pattern completely. Instead of replacing every dead tree in the original line, Henry planted behind surviving trees. The strongest established trees became the outer layer, smaller rejects and replacements went behind them, where the land allowed. Henry preserved low shrubs and existing vegetation instead of clearing everything between the rows. Tom Barrett arrived while Henry was marking the new positions. "Your lines are crooked." "Yep." "You know how string works?" Henry smiled. "Used some once." Tom pointed toward the irregular planting. "Then why not straighten this?" Henry walked him to the western edge. He held up two pieces of cloth. One stood in open wind. The other was positioned behind several surviving trees and shrubs. "Watch." The exposed strip stretched almost horizontal. The protected one fluttered. Tom stared. "Still windy." "Supposed to be." "I thought you're building a windbreak." "I am." "Then break the wind." Henry shook his head. "I don't need a wall." That was the mistake he'd made when he first imagined the project. A wall sounded useful because a wall stopped things. But Henry wasn't trying to eliminate air movement. He wanted to reduce the force reaching vulnerable ground. Trees could do that without forming an impenetrable barrier. Branches, leaves, trunks, multiple layers. The wind would pass through them, but it would not pass through unchanged. Henry began thinking vertically too. The taller surviving trees formed one level, smaller trees occupied another. Existing low vegetation filled space closer to the ground where appropriate. Not every section looked identical because the farm wasn't identical. The exposed ridge needed more depth. The protected depression needed less. Behind the equipment shed, Henry connected new plantings to protection that already existed. Everywhere. He worked from what had survived. By early summer, the system looked messier than ever. Tom called it Henry's jungle. Henry considered that an improvement. Then came the first useful test. A hot western wind arrived after 4 days without rain. Henry walked to the northwest boundary. Outside the tree rose. Dust moved close to the ground. The orange cloth snapped. He stepped through the first layer. Wind remained obvious. Through the second. Less. Then farther into the protected side. Henry stopped. He could still feel air against his face. But the constant pressure was reduced. He crouched. Loose surface material wasn't moving as aggressively there. Henry pushed his fingers into the soil, then walked back outside the windbreak and did the same. He didn't trust one comparison. So he marked both locations. Same afternoon. Same general soil type. One exposed. One protected. He returned the next morning. Then again the following afternoon. The protected location wasn't magically wet, but it was drying differently. Henry wrote, "Check again after longer dry period." He underlined it. That was important. He had made enough mistakes to know one encouraging observation wasn't proof. But for the first time, the change he'd spent more than a year trying to create was measurable, without looking at the trees themselves. The effect was appearing behind them. Henry walked along the new layered planting. Many trees remained ugly by nursery standards. One leaned almost 40 degrees. Another had 3 competing stems. Several were permanently undersized. Yet together they created something no individual tree could. Depth. Roughness. Resistance. A living zone the wind had to move through before reaching Henry's field. That evening, he stood beside the original straight row. He had once imagined 5,000 trees forming a fence around his dying farm. Now he understood why that idea had been too simple. A fence had one line of defense. Henry's system could have several late. The first trees took the exposure. The next occupied slightly calmer conditions. Smaller vegetation filled lower gaps. And farther inside sat the ground. Henry had been trying to protect all along. Henry crossed out one sentence in his old notebook. Build a windbreak. Underneath it, he wrote, build a protected side. The difference was only 4 words. On the land, it changed everything. Because Henry finally understood that the real value of those 5,000 rejected trees would never be measured by how straight they grew. It would be measured by what happened to the farm after the wind passed through them. The first real change appeared where Henry hadn't been looking. Not in the trees, in the ground behind them. By mid-July, the farm had gone 12 days without meaningful rain. The rejected trees showed it. Leaves on the outer rows curled during the hottest hours. Several younger trees required extra attention. The northwest ridge still looked harsher than every other section. But the layered windbreak was finally tall and dense enough to affect the air moving through it. Henry wanted to know whether that difference mattered after the wind passed. So the 70-year-old farmer chose 3 locations. The first was 50 feet outside the protected boundary, fully exposed to the prevailing western wind. The second sat directly among the trees. The third was 20 feet inside the farm, behind several layers of established trunks, branches, and lower vegetation. Henry drove a numbered stake into each location. Then he dug. At stake 1, the exposed surface was hard and dry. The shovel entered several inches before meeting greater resistance. Henry took a handful of soil and squeezed. It fell apart almost immediately. He moved to stake 2. The ground beneath the trees contained fallen leaves, small twigs, veets, and older plant material beginning to break down. Henry noticed that but kept moving. Stake 3 mattered most. 20 feet behind the trees, he pushed the shovel down. The upper surface was dry, but several inches below, the soil felt cooler. Henry squeezed a handful. It held together briefly. He looked toward stake 1. Then, back at the trees. Not enough. One comparison could fool him. Different soil. Different shade. A small depression he hadn't noticed. So, Henry expanded the test. He marked 6 more locations along the western boundary. Exposed. Inside the tree rows. Protected side. Then he checked them every 2 days. The pattern wasn't identical everywhere. That interested him. Some protected sites showed little difference. Others showed a clear one. The strongest effects appeared behind the sections where several layers of trees and vegetation had survived. Henry opened his notebook. Denser section soil stays workable longer. Then, gaps, smaller difference. The dead trees had taught him where his farm was hardest. Now the living ones were teaching him where the system had begun working. Tom Barrett arrived during one of Henry's checks. Henry handed him the shovel. Dig there. Tom dug outside the windbreak. Then Henry led him through the trees. 20 feet inside. Again. Tom pushed the shovel down. He lifted a section and rubbed it between his fingers. More moisture. Seems that way. You watering here? No. Schade. Some. Tom looked toward the tree rows. And less wind. Henry nodded. That was the important part. He wasn't claiming the trees had created water. They hadn't. Rainfall was the same. The windbreak hadn't repaired decades of declining soil in 2 seasons either. But it had begun changing the conditions under which the soil lost moisture. Less direct exposure in protected areas. Some shade. Reduced wind speed. Leaf litter accumulating beneath the trees. More surface protection where vegetation was establishing. Small changes. But Henry's farm had been dying through small losses repeated thousands of times. A little more moisture lost today. A little more topsoil exposed tomorrow. Another stressed crop. Another bare patch. Henry was beginning to reverse the process the same way. Incrementally, on the 15th dry day, he performed another test. He placed identical shallow containers of water at the exposed stake, and behind one of the strongest windbreak sections. It wasn't laboratory science. Henry knew that, but by evening, the exposed container had lost noticeably more. He didn't need the exact number to understand the direction. Moving dry, air mattered. The next morning, Henry walked behind the tree rows before sunrise. Dew clung to some of the vegetation. Birds moved through the branches. Leaves from the previous season had collected against stems instead of blowing completely across the field. He crouched and lifted the litter. Darkness underneath. Cooler soil. Then Henry realized something. For 2 years, everyone, including him, had been watching the trees. How many lived? How tall were they? How crooked? How many still looked weak? Those were reasonable questions. But they weren't the question that determined whether Henry's experiment succeeded. He walked 20 feet into the farm. The trees were behind him now. In front of him lay the land he'd been trying to protect. That was where the answer had to appear. Henry pushed the shovel into the ground once more. It entered easier than it did outside the boundary. Not everywhere, not dramatically, but repeatedly enough that he could no longer dismiss it. Tom stood beside him. So the bad trees are making better soil? Henry shook his head. Too soon to say that. He pointed toward the windbreak. They're changing what reaches it. That distinction mattered. The trees weren't miracle soil builders. They were becoming infrastructure. Living infrastructure. Individually, some remained crooked, undersized, and commercially worthless. Together, enough had survived to alter the environment on the protected side. Henry looked at the numbered stakes disappearing along the western field. The first improvement had not appeared in a trunk. It had appeared 20 feet behind thousands of them, and for the first time, Henry could see exactly what those rejected trees were protecting. By the second summer, Henry no longer needed orange ribbons to know when he crossed the boundary. He could feel it. On the west side of the trees, the wind pressed against his shirt and kept it there. Branches twisted. Dry grass bent southeast. Loose dust moved close to the ground. Henry stepped through the first layer. The wind remained. Through the second. It changed. By the time he reached the inner side, air still moved across his face, but the constant pressure was gone. Henry stopped. 20 feet. That was all. 20 feet in the same afternoon felt different. Tom Barrett found him standing there with his eyes closed. You sleeping? Come here. I am here. No. Come from that side. Tom walked outside the trees. Henry waited. Now walk toward me. Tom stepped through the outer row. Then the second. Then the denser inner growth. He stopped beside Henry. Neither man spoke. Finally, Tom looked back. Well, I'll be damned. Henry smiled. What? Tom pointed through the trees. It feels like two different farms. Henry's smile disappeared. Not two farms. He looked at the branches moving above them. Same farm? Different exposure. That distinction mattered. The trees hadn't created rain. They hadn't cooled the entire property. They hadn't repaired poor soil or eliminated summer heat. They had changed what happened to the wind before it reached this side. And after 2 seasons, the difference was beginning to leave evidence. Henry walked to 2 marked patches. One sat outside the protected edge. The other lay behind the deepest section of trees. Both had received the same recent rain. He pushed a narrow spade into the exposed ground. The surface broke hard. Inside the windbreak, the blade entered more easily. Not everywhere. Not every day. But often enough that Henry had stopped calling it coincidence. Then he noticed something he hadn't planned. Leaves. Thousands of them. The ugly nursery trees had begun dropping litter beneath themselves. Leaves caught against grass. Twigs collected between trunks. Small pockets of debris gathered where the wind no longer swept everything clean. Tom kicked through one. You going to clean this out? Henry stared at him. Why? Looks messy. Henry crouched and lifted a handful of dry leaves. 2 years earlier, appearance had been the nursery's standard. Straight trunks. Balanced crowns. Clean rows. Now Henry was looking at something entirely different. The mess was staying. That mattered. Outside the trees, exposed ground still lost loose material easily during hard wind. Inside, stems and low vegetation trapped some of what moved. Leaves accumulated. Shade appeared in narrow patches. The ground wasn't transformed, but it was being treated differently by the same summer. Henry opened his notebook. For months he had written, exposed, protected, windward, leeward. That afternoon he crossed them out. He wrote 2 simpler words. Outside, inside. Tom read them. So now you really do have 2 climates. Henry shook his head. No. He looked toward the western field shimmering in the heat, then toward the irregular wall of crooked trunks surrounding them. A buffered one. The phrase stayed with him. That was what 5,000 rejected trees were becoming. Not a forest. Not a wall. A buffer. A place where wind lost some force before reaching vulnerable ground. A place where leaves weren't carried away as quickly. a place where certain patches held workable soil a little longer after rain. And the strangest part was that no individual tree looked responsible. Henry walked back through the rows. The shaped tree was still there. Another had lost its top during winter and grown sideways. Several remained thin. Some original planting positions were empty where trees had died. None of them looked capable of changing 80 acres. But Henry no longer looked at them one at a time. Outside, the wind struck the first layer. What passed through met another. Then another. Every trunk took a little. Every branch disrupted a little. Every gap mattered. Every surviving cluster protected something behind it. The nursery had asked whether each tree was strong enough to stand alone. Henry was discovering that it had never been the important question. That evening, the western wind rose again. Henry stood inside the boundary, while thousands of crooked branches moved between him and the open fields. The farm was still dry. Summer was still summer, but the wind no longer reached everything the way it once had. And soon, Henry would find out whether that difference still mattered when the weather stopped being forgiving. The real test came in late August. Henry heard the wind before sunrise. It pushed against the western side of the farmhouse in long, steady gusts. By 6 in the morning, the trees along the boundary were already moving hard. Henry stepped onto the porch. The air was hot, too hot for that hour, and dry. The farm had received little rain for almost 2 weeks. Soil moisture was already declining before the wind arrived. Henry looked west. This was exactly the kind of weather he'd planted 5,000 rejected trees to face. By noon, the temperature climbed higher. The outer tree rows bent east. Branches whipped against one another. Several younger trees lost leaves. One small tree on the northwest ridge snapped near a damaged fork. Henry found it lying across the ground. Years earlier, losing another tree would have felt like evidence of failure. Now he looked past it. The second layer was still standing. Then the third. Henry tied an orange ribbon outside the boundary. It pulled nearly horizontal. He walked through the first row. The wind remained strong. Through the second, reduced. Then, 20 feet into the field, the ribbon still moved, but no longer violently. Henry crouched. This was what he'd been waiting to see. Not whether the trees could stop the wind, whether they could force it to spend some of its energy before reaching the farm. The next morning, the wind was stronger. Tom Barrett arrived shortly after 8. His pickup was coated in dust. "Westfield's getting hammered," he said. Henry climbed into the truck. Tom drove him toward the neighboring property. There were few trees between the road and the field. Dust moved across the surface in thin sheets. Plants twisted continuously in the hot air. Tom stopped. "Been like this since yesterday." Henry stepped out. The wind hit his face immediately. He didn't criticize Tom's land. His own farm had looked much the same before the trees. They drove back. Outside Henry's western boundary, conditions were similar. Hot, dry, windy. Then they walked through the trees. Tom stopped before Henry said anything. The crowns above them were moving violently. The outer edge looked like it was taking a beating, but behind several layers, the field felt less exposed. Tom looked back. "They're eating the wind." Henry shook his head, slowing it. That distinction mattered. Nothing was being defeated. The wind continued through. Heat continued through. Moisture was still being lost. But the conditions reaching the protected interior were no longer identical to those hitting the first row. By the second afternoon, Henry began checking his numbered soil stakes. Outside first, the upper soil had dried hard. He dug several inches. Then he moved behind one of the strongest windbreak sections. Dry at the surface. Cooler below. Still more workable. At a large gap farther south, the difference was smaller. Henry wrote that down too. Dense layers holding effect. Large gaps, more exposure. The system was showing both its strengths and weaknesses under pressure. On the third day, the wind reached its worst. Henry walked the perimeter at dawn. 2 more young trees had broken. Several outer trees showed leaf damage. One old reject leaned farther than it had the previous week. Henry put his hand against its trunk. still anchored. Behind it stood dozens more. That was when the meaning of the original 5,000 finally became obvious. Henry hadn't needed every tree to become strong. He had needed enough of them to survive in enough layers that the failure of one didn't reopen the entire farm to the wind. One tree could break. The system remained. By late afternoon, Henry walked into the field. Plants in the most protected zones were stressed. He could see that. This wasn't a miracle barrier. But they weren't experiencing the same constant mechanical pressure he felt outside the tree rows. Surface material remained in place better in sheltered sections. And the soil comparisons continued showing the same pattern Henry had documented before the extreme event. The trees weren't creating moisture. They were helping reduce one pathway by which exposed land lost it quickly. That evening, the wind finally weakened. For the first time in 3 days, the outer branches became quiet. Henry walked the western boundary. The damage was visible. Broken limbs, scattered leaves, 3 dead or badly damaged young trees, several ugly gaps. Then he turned around. Behind them was the farm, still stressed, still dry, still needing rain, but protected enough that Henry could see the difference between exposure and buffering. Tom joined him at the northwest corner. He touched the crooked tree Henry had planted first. "You remember this one?" "Yep. Thought it'd be dead the first summer." "So did I." Tom looked along the thousands of irregular trees. "Still ugly." Henry smiled. "Wind doesn't care." For years, the nursery had judged those trees by how they looked standing alone. The 3-day dry wind had given them another test. Not one at a time. Together, Henry looked at the broken tree on the ground, then at the living layers behind it. 5,000 weak trees had never become 5,000 perfect trees. They had become something far more useful, a place for the wind to hit before it reached everything Henry was trying to keep alive. Paul Mercer returned to Henry's farm almost 4 years after the nursery had given up the trees. He wasn't there to inspect them. At first, he didn't even recognize them. Paul was driving past when he noticed the western boundary. What had once been an open view into Henry's fields was now interrupted by a long, irregular band of vegetation. Tall crowns rose above smaller trees. Shrubs occupied some of the lower gaps. Several sections were thick enough that Paul couldn't clearly see the field behind them. He slowed, then turned into Henry's driveway. Henry was 74 now. He was repairing a gate when Paul stepped from the truck. "Those trees yours?" Henry looked west. "Most of them." Paul stared. "Where'd you get that many?" Henry stopped working. "From you." Paul looked at him, then back at the boundary. It took several seconds. "Those are the rejects?" Henry nodded. Paul walked closer. The surprise disappeared when he reached the first row. Up close, the trees were still imperfect. One trunk curved almost 18 inches from vertical before correcting itself. Another split low into 2 major stems. Some crowns were uneven. Several trees remained much smaller than others planted the same year. And there were gaps. Paul touched one crooked trunk. "We still wouldn't sell this." "I know." "This one either." "I know." Paul pointed toward another. "Bad structure." Henry nodded. "Probably." Paul looked confused. "You're agreeing with me?" "You weren't wrong." That wasn't the answer Paul expected. Henry had never needed the nursery to be wrong. Those trees really had been poor commercial stock. A customer paying retail price for a landscape tree had every reason to want something straighter, healthier looking, and more uniform. But Henry hadn't been landscaping a front yard. He pointed toward the farm. "Come here." They walked outside the western boundary. The afternoon wind hit them immediately. Henry pulled an orange ribbon from his pocket. He still carried them after all these years. He held it up. The cloth stretched east. Then Henry led Paul through the first layer. Branches moved overhead. Through the second, then farther inside. Henry raised another ribbon. It fluttered, but with noticeably less force. Paul looked toward the trees. Henry said nothing. They walked to one of the numbered soil stakes. Henry pushed a shovel into the protected ground. Then they returned to a comparable exposed location. He repeated the test. "Trees doing that?" Paul asked. Trees are part of it. Henry wouldn't give them credit for everything. Years of management mattered. Ground cover mattered. Rainfall mattered. Soil differences mattered. But Henry had enough observations now to know that the protected portions of his farm behaved differently from the fully exposed edge, especially during hot, dry wind. Paul walked back toward the boundary. How many survived? Never got 5,000 adults? Henry pointed toward several younger replacements. Lost plenty the first years. How many? Enough to teach me not to plant them all the same way. Paul smiled. Henry showed him the northwest ridge. Some of the original dead trunks were still there. Behind them, however, stood layers built from survivors and later replacements. The first row failed badly here. Exposure? Partly. Moisture too. Some trees were just poor. Paul nodded. That answer made sense to a nurseryman. Then Henry pointed behind the surviving outer trees. Those gave the next ones a better chance. Paul studied the arrangement. It wasn't a conventional nursery planting. It wasn't a neat shelter belt either. It followed Henry's failures. Dense, where exposure was strongest. Thinner, where existing protection already helped. Irregular, because the land itself was irregular. Paul walked to one particularly ugly tree. The trunk leaned. Its crown was asymmetrical. By commercial standards, it was exactly what the nursery had called it years earlier. Weak stock, but it was alive. And behind it stood another tree. Then another. Beyond those was Henry's field. Paul slapped the trunk lightly. Most of these still wouldn't pass our grading. Henry looked at the branches moving above them. Good thing the wind can't read your grading sheet. Paul laughed. Then he became quiet. He finally understood that Henry had never proved the nursery's grading system wrong. He had changed the test. The nursery evaluated each tree alone. Straightness, uniformity, appearance, growth. Henry evaluated thousands together. Survival, position, density, protection. One system measured what customers would purchase. The other measured what the land needed. Before leaving, Paul stood outside the boundary once more. Wind pressed against his shirt. Then he stepped through. The difference was subtle but undeniable. He turned toward Henry. You built this out of trees we were going to throw away. Henry shook his head. No. He looked along the crooked trunks. They built it. Paul drove away shortly before sunset. Henry remained beside the first row. Thousands of trees surrounded sections of a farm that had once faced the western wind, almost naked. Some were still weak. Some were still ugly. Some would eventually fail. That didn't bother Henry anymore. Because after 4 years, he finally understood something. The nursery never had reason to measure. Individually, the trees had been rejects. Together, they had become infrastructure. 5 years after the first trailer arrived, Henry walked the western boundary alone. He was 75 now. His pace had slowed. The trees hadn't. Some were 15 feet tall. Others remained half that size. Several leaned permanently east from years of western wind. A few had split trunks. Many would still have looked terrible lined up for sale at a nursery. Henry liked them that way. Not because crooked trees were somehow better, but because their imperfections reminded him what the project had actually required. He stopped beside one of the original red stakes. The tree planted there had died during the first summer. Henry had never removed the stake. Behind it stood another tree. That one had survived. Behind that was a smaller tree planted 2 years later. Then shrubs. Low vegetation. Leaf litter covered the soil beneath them. Henry pushed his boot through it. 5 years earlier, this section had been exposed ground. Hot wind crossed it without resistance. Loose material moved east. Young plants struggled. Moisture disappeared faster than Henry could afford to replace it. Now the western edge had depth. Not everywhere. There were still gaps. There were still sections Henry wanted to improve. But it no longer felt like the edge of the farm ended at a fence. The farm faded gradually into layers of vegetation. Henry walked outside them. The afternoon wind struck his shirt immediately. He stopped, then stepped back through the trees. Branches moved above him. Leaves trembled. Air continued through. But by the time Henry reached the protected side, its force had changed. He smiled. That was all he'd ever needed. Not no wind. Less exposure. Henry continued toward the field. The land inside hadn't transformed into paradise. That mattered. Poor areas still existed. Dry summers still demanded careful water management. Trees themselves consumed water. Some competed with nearby vegetation. And no windbreak could manufacture rainfall. Henry understood all of that. But the farm now had something it hadn't possessed when those 5,000 rejects arrived. A buffer. Behind the strongest sections, Henry had repeatedly observed soil remaining workable longer during dry, windy periods. Leaf litter accumulated where bare ground once dominated. More vegetation survived in protected pockets. Birds nested among the branches. Insects moved through flowering plants that had established along portions of the boundary. One change had created conditions for another. Not overnight. Year after year, Henry reached the northwest corner. The first tree was still there. The crooked one. The tree Tom had laughed at. Its trunk had thickened considerably. But the original bend remained. Henry placed his palm against it. The tree would never become straight. It didn't need to. He looked east. Behind that one tree stood another. Then another. Then hundreds more disappearing along the boundary. That was when Henry understood why the number 5,000 had mattered. Not because all 5,000 survived. They hadn't. Hundreds failed during establishment. Others died later. Some were removed when Henry discovered problems. Some positions required replacements. The original number mattered because it gave Henry enough living material to stop thinking about individual perfection. One tree could fail. Another could remain undersized. A third could grow crooked. But if enough survived in the right places, the system could still function. Tom joined him near sunset. You ever count what's left? Henry shook his head. Stopped years ago. Don't you want to know? Know what? How many of your 5,000 made it? Henry looked along the boundary. That isn't the number that matters. Tom waited. Henry pointed toward the field. That is, the land was still producing, still imperfect, still vulnerable to weather. But it no longer faced every hot western wind completely exposed. Tom touched the crooked first tree. Remember what I said about this thing? Every word. I said it couldn't save your farm. Henry smiled. You were right. Tom looked surprised. Henry stepped away from the tree. One tree didn't? He swept his hand toward the entire boundary. The answer was standing in front of them. Not one heroic tree. Not one miracle species. Not 5,000 perfect survivors. A layered living system, built from whatever could establish wherever the land allowed it. The nursery had evaluated the trees individually because that was its job. A straight tree had commercial value. A crooked, undersized specimen often didn't. Henry had eventually discovered another kind of value. A tree could be commercially weak and still provide branches for wind to move through. It could still cast some shade, drop leaves, hold a place in a larger layer, protect something behind it. The sun lowered behind the western rows. Henry's shadow stretched east into the farm. For years, he'd thought he was planting trees around dying land. Looking at the boundary now, that description felt wrong. He had been building conditions under which the land had a better chance to keep going. Henry turned toward the farmhouse. Behind him, the wind entered the outer trees. Branches bent. Leaves shook. The air moved through the first layer, then the second, then the third. By the time it reached the farm, it was still wind, just less punishing than before. 5 years earlier, the nursery had thrown those trees away because they weren't strong enough to sell. Henry had never needed them to be. He only needed enough of them to be strong enough to stand.